The laughter reached 12-year-old Ellie Mason before she even reached the porch of Larkspur Hollow's general store. It was sharp, cruel, and loud enough for everyone in the dusty little Wyoming town to hear. "Look at her boots." Ellie stopped. Wade Pruitt, the banker's spoiled 12-year-old son, pointed directly at her feet. Her boots were old. The leather was cracked, the soles were worn thin, and one side had split badly enough that Ellie had wrapped it with twine to keep it together. "Charity boots for a charity girl," Wade sneered. A few children laughed. Ellie's fingers tightened around a basket of eggs she carried. She had walked 2 miles from the Mason homestead that morning to sell those eggs. The money would buy flour. Maybe some salt. If she was lucky, perhaps a little coffee for her mother. Her father had been dead for 2 years. Since then, every winter had been a struggle. Every sack of flour mattered. Every egg mattered. Every penny mattered. Ellie swallowed the shame rising in her throat. Her mother, Grace, had taught her not to answer cruelty with cruelty. Let them laugh, Ellie. Laughing costs them nothing, and it'll cost you nothing to ignore it. So Ellie lifted her chin. She kept walking. But the words still hurt. They always did. What Ellie didn't know was that someone else had been watching. A stranger stood beside the hitching post across the street. His black hat was pulled low. Dust covered his long coat. One boot rested against the wooden rail. He looked like another weary cattleman who had spent too many days in the saddle. Nobody in Larkspur Hollow knew his name. Nobody knew why he had arrived. And nobody had the slightest idea that the quiet stranger was one of the wealthiest men in the American West. His name was Nathaniel Cole. And before the day was over, the entire town would be talking about him. Nathaniel had been riding for 3 days. He had come to Larkspur Hollow on business. His railroad company was considering a new spur through the territory, and his engineers had identified several possible routes. One of those routes ran dangerously close to the Mason property. Nathaniel wasn't interested in announcing his wealth. He had learned something early in life. Money changed people's behavior. When people believed you were rich, they suddenly became kinder. More respectful. More eager to shake your hand. Nathaniel preferred to know who people really were. So he traveled quietly. He watched. And he listened. That was why the scene outside the general store caught his attention. A poor girl being mocked for wearing broken boots. Nathaniel looked at Ellie. Then at the children laughing around her. Something inside him went still. Because suddenly he wasn't looking at a 12-year-old girl in Wyoming. He was remembering his own mother. Decades earlier, in Missouri, she had stood outside a schoolhouse wearing patched clothes while other children laughed at her. Nathaniel remembered being a boy. He remembered the hunger. The cold winters. The shame. And most of all, he remembered the one stranger who had shown his mother kindness when everyone else had looked away. Nathaniel pushed himself away from the hitching post. Then he walked toward Ellie. The laughter slowly faded. "That's a fine basket of eggs," he said. Ellie looked up. "Thank you, sir." "You selling them?" "Yes, sir." "How much?" 10 cents a dozen. Nathaniel glanced at the basket. "How many?" 3 dozen. "I'll take the lot." He reached inside his coat. The children watched curiously. Nathaniel pulled out a crisp $5 note. Ellie's eyes widened. Even Wade stopped smiling. "Mister," Wade said, "that's a $5 note." Nathaniel looked at him. "It is." Ellie shook her head. "Sir, I can't take that." "You can. But the eggs aren't worth $5. "I know." Nathaniel handed her the money. "Keep the eggs." Ellie stared at him. "Give them to your mother." "But. You walked 2 miles carrying something fragile." His eyes dropped toward her broken boots. "And you didn't drop a single egg." Then he looked directly at Wade. That's not something to laugh at. The children grew silent. Nathaniel continued. That's grit. He turned back toward Ellie. And grit is worth more than any bank in this territory. Ellie looked down at the $5 note. For the first time that morning, she didn't feel ashamed of her boots. She felt proud of herself. And across the street, Wade Pruitt stood completely silent. Nathaniel's kindness became the town's favorite gossip before sunset. By supper, people had invented at least 6 different stories about him. Some said he was a gambler. Others believed he was a cattle buyer. One man swore he'd seen him carrying a gun under his coat and claimed he was probably an outlaw. Nobody knew the truth. Not yet. 3 days later, old Silas Bennett rode into town from the county seat. He carried news that changed everything. The stranger at the inn, he announced. His name is Nathaniel Cole. The room went quiet. Silas continued. The Nathaniel Cole. Everyone stared. The railroad man. The cattle baron. The millionaire. The man whose cattle empire stretched across 3 territories. The man whose railroad had already built depots between Cheyenne and Denver. The stranger who had paid $5 for 3 dozen eggs. Suddenly, everybody wanted to know Nathaniel. Especially banker Elias Pruitt. Within an hour, the banker was standing at Nathaniel's inn room with his hat in his hands. He smiled. Mr. Cole, it would be an honor to discuss several investment opportunities with you. Nathaniel listened politely. The banker talked about railroads, land, business, the future of Larkspur Hollow. He even mentioned his son Wade. My boy would be delighted to show you around. Nathaniel finally raised a hand. Mr. Pruitt. Yes. Do you know Grace Mason? The banker's smile disappeared. The widow? Yes. And her daughter? Ellie. Pruitt shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel leaned back. How long has Grace been struggling to keep that farm? 3 years, perhaps. And your bank owns the note? Pruitt said nothing. Nathaniel's expression hardened. In 3 years, did your bank ever offer her a fair extension? No. A reasonable price for her grain? No. Any assistance at all? The banker lowered his eyes. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Then perhaps we should discuss business another day. Pruitt knew he'd just lost something. He simply didn't know what. The following Sunday, Nathaniel saddled his horse. He rode toward the Mason homestead. The property sat at the edge of town. The house was small. The fence needed repairing. The barn had seen better days. And in the middle of the yard stood Grace Mason. She was driving a fence post into the ground. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her hands were rough. Her brown hair was tied loosely behind her head. She looked tired. But she kept working. Nathaniel stopped his horse. Grace looked up. She didn't smile. Can I help you? Nathaniel removed his hat. Mrs. Mason. She studied him. I'm Nathaniel Cole. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The railroad man. That's what they tell me. You bought my daughter's eggs. I did. Grace looked toward the barn. How much did you pay? $5. She stared at him. Mr. Cole, those eggs weren't worth $5. I know. Then why? Nathaniel paused. Because your daughter earned it. Something in Grace's expression softened. She lowered the hammer. You'd better come inside. Nathaniel followed her into the small farmhouse. She offered him coffee. Nathaniel accepted. But before she could pour it, he noticed there was barely enough left in the pot. You don't have to give me yours. Grace looked at him. It's coffee. It's also something you may need more than I do. For the first time, she smiled. It was small. But Nathaniel noticed. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself wanting to see that smile again. Nathaniel explained why he'd come. His railroad needed a depot near Larkspur Hollow. His engineers had studied the land. The Mason property was the ideal location. "I want to buy a portion of your land," he said. Grace stiffened. "I can't sell the whole farm." "I don't want the whole farm." She looked confused. "I'll pay you fairly for the section we need. You'll keep the rest." Grace stared at him. "Why?" "Because it's a business transaction." She studied his face. "You could have offered me almost nothing." "I could have. But you won't." "No." "Why?" Nathaniel looked down at his coffee. Then he told her the truth. "Because my mother was once where you are." Grace said nothing. Poor. Alone. Trying to raise a child while people looked at her like she was invisible. His voice softened. Someone gave her a chance. He looked back at Grace. "I never forgot it." Grace's eyes became glassy. Then Nathaniel added something she never expected. "I also want to offer Ellie a place at the territorial school in Cheyenne." Grace froze. "School? Tuition? Room? Board?" She shook her head. "We can't afford that." "You won't have to." "I don't accept charity." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Neither do I." He leaned forward. "This isn't charity, Mrs. Mason. It's an investment." "In what?" Nathaniel looked toward the window. At Ellie, outside, trying to repair the chicken coop. "In a girl who deserves a chance." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she quietly began to cry. Nathaniel didn't move. He simply sat there, giving her the dignity of not having to hide her tears. By autumn, construction had begun. The railroad depot transformed Larkspur Hollow. Men found work. Businesses began opening. The town grew. And the Mason family finally had breathing room. But something else had changed. Nathaniel began visiting more often. At first, he said it was business. Then Grace noticed he always seemed to find a reason to stop by her farm. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he came to inspect the construction. Sometimes he simply sat on the porch drinking coffee. One evening, Grace finally asked him, "Do you really need to check that depot this often?" Nathaniel smiled. "No." "Then why do you keep coming?" He looked at her. For once, the wealthy railroad man had no clever answer. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I like the coffee." Grace laughed. "You don't even like my coffee." "No." "Then what do you like?" Nathaniel's smile faded. His eyes remained on hers. "You." Grace stopped laughing. The wind moved softly through the cottonwood trees. Neither spoke. Because both of them knew something had changed. Nathaniel had come to Larkspur Hollow looking for land. He had found something he hadn't expected. A home. Or perhaps the possibility of one. Wade Pruitt eventually apologized to Ellie. Not because his father demanded it. Not because Nathaniel Cole was wealthy. But because he finally understood what his words had done. "I'm sorry," he said one afternoon outside the schoolhouse. Ellie studied him. "Why?" "Because I was cruel." She nodded. "That's true." Wade looked embarrassed. Then Ellie smiled. "It's okay." He smiled back. "Friends? Maybe." And for Wade, that was enough. The following spring, Ellie left for Cheyenne. She wore a new pair of boots. But when someone asked who had bought them, she shook her head. "I earned them." She had helped survey the railroad route. She had carried water for the workers. She had worked hard. And she was proud. Grace watched her daughter ride away. Nathaniel stood beside her. "You'll miss her," he said. Every day. So will I. Grace looked at him. You're becoming part of this family, Nathaniel. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Grace laughed softly. Then Nathaniel reached for her hand. She let him take it. And for the first time in years, Grace Mason allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by loss. Nathaniel Cole never moved permanently to Larkspur Hollow. He remained a railroad man. A cattleman. A traveler. But he returned twice a year. Always quietly. Always without the grand entrance people expected from a millionaire. He checked the depot. He checked on the workers. And most importantly, he checked on Grace and Ellie. Ellie grew taller. Then wiser. Then educated. She returned home every summer with stories from Cheyenne and dreams much bigger than the little farm where she'd been raised. And Grace? She learned how to smile again. The woman who had once struggled to keep food on the table eventually stood beside a man who had ridden into town as a stranger and somehow become family. Years later, people in Larkspur Hollow still remembered the day a millionaire cowboy bought a poor girl's eggs for $5. But that wasn't really what they remembered. They remembered what happened afterward. They remembered that Nathaniel Cole never looked down on someone simply because they had less. They remembered that Grace Mason's daughter went to school. They remembered that a struggling farm became the beginning of something bigger. And they remembered that the wealthiest man in town had discovered something money could never buy. A reason to care. Because sometimes the greatest fortune a person can find isn't buried beneath the earth. Sometimes it is sitting quietly on a weathered porch. Waiting for someone kind enough to recognize its value. And in Larkspur Hollow, they never forgot the lesson. Kindness can change a life. Respect can restore a person's dignity. And sometimes, love arrives when you're least expecting it. The end. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Whispers of the West for more unforgettable cowboy romances, frontier mysteries, unexpected love stories, and tales from the Old West.